They made her stand by the wall during a board meeting, called her a diversity token, and joked that she should take notes since real strategy was above her pay grade, all because she was a black woman. That's where this story begins, not with fairness, not with respect, but with a blatant attempt to humiliate someone they thought had no power. They stripped her of access, stole her ideas, erased her name, and laughed behind closed doors, convinced no one would ever hold them accountable. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know she wasn't just another face. They didn't know she was their superior in disguise. What happens next will flip everything you thought you knew about justice, power, and identity. Stay with us, because this isn't just another workplace story. This is the moment silence turns into reckoning. Like if this hit you. Subscribe if you're tired of seeing the powerful get away with it. And tell us in comments, where are you watching from? And what would you have done in her place? The glass-walled executive boardroom of Logan and Myers gleamed under the morning sun, casting sharp reflections across the sleek marble floor as the city skyline towered behind it. At precisely 7:58 a.m., Danielle Brooks entered, her heels tapping softly against the floor, her presence subtle but commanding. Dressed in a tailored navy blazer, cream blouse, and dark slacks, she carried a leather portfolio and the quiet poise of someone used to navigating rooms that weren't built for her. Her hair was pinned neatly at the back, her posture flawless, and her eyes alert. Inside, the meeting had not yet started, but all the top-level team members were present, chatting in hushed tones, sipping overpriced coffee in branded mugs that marked their hierarchy. At the head of the long mahogany table sat John Carter, the West Coast Regional Director, a man who made it clear, without ever needing to raise his voice, that this was his floor, his city, and his power game. Tall, early 40s, with a smirk that never quite faded and a Rolex he tapped when impatient. John looked up as Danielle walked in. His eyes scanned her from head to toe, unreadable at first, then slightly amused. Without standing, without even gesturing, he said, "Seats against the wall are still available." He returned his gaze to his phone, dismissing her as effortlessly as one might wave off background noise. Danielle paused, just long enough for a few heads to turn, just long enough to register the slight tightening of jaws and the uncomfortable silence that followed. But she said nothing. She walked over, pulled out a chair near the far end of the room, and sat. Her expression gave nothing away, but her silence spoke volumes. The others at the table didn't look at her. Or rather, they looked, but only when they thought she wouldn't notice. She noticed everything. At 8 o'clock sharp, John clapped his hands once and leaned forward, his tone clipped and businesslike. "Now that we're all settled, let's focus on today's strategy alignment. We'll keep things efficient. Real voices, real input." The implication wasn't subtle. She wasn't one of the voices that mattered. Danielle opened her portfolio and clicked her pen once. Her face remained composed. The meeting lasted nearly 90 minutes. During that time, she was not introduced. Her credentials were not acknowledged. No one invited her to speak. At one point, when she gently raised a hand to offer data on Q3 performance, which she had contributed to directly through her prior consulting work, John waved her off with a chuckle. "Let's hold questions until the end. We've got a solid rhythm going," he said, never looking at her directly. When he praised the junior associate, a white intern who had been with the company for 3 months, calling him a sharp mind with natural leadership instincts, the compliment was followed by a pointed glance toward Danielle's corner. "Leadership can't be taught," he added, as if offering wisdom. "You either show it or you don't." That got a few awkward laughs. Most just stayed quiet. Danielle took notes, not about the campaign metrics, but about the people, their expressions, their silences, their loyalties. The meeting concluded with John standing, stretching slightly, and saying, "Good energy today. Let's carry that through to Q4. He walked out without a glance in her direction. She didn't expect one. By the time she returned to her desk, her inbox had 2 alerts. One was a calendar invite to a culture integration lunch, a title that felt more like a trap than a welcome. The other was a denial of access request. The analytics dashboard she'd been told she'd oversee was restricted. She double-checked. Still locked out. She sent a follow-up to IT. They replied within minutes. Per internal policy, elevated access must be approved by your direct supervisor. The signature at the bottom read, John Carter. She stood, adjusted her jacket, and made her way to his corner office. She knocked once, stepped in. I noticed I don't have access to the analytics or campaign reports, she said calmly. John looked up, didn't smile. That's intentional, he replied. We're evaluating fit. Let's make sure you're aligned before handing over proprietary data. That wasn't in the onboarding or the role description, she said, still even-toned. I assumed this was a full assignment, not a trial. Consider it a practical filter, he said, leaning back. Sometimes the right title doesn't mean the right capability. I need to see what you do with what you've got, not what you've read on a resume. Danielle didn't blink. Understood, she said, and left without another word. Back at her desk, she opened her personal notes file and typed a single line. Stage 1, complete. That night, she reviewed the day's interactions frame by frame. The facial expressions, the passive compliance, the way the HR team had been CC'd on emails but never replied. She wasn't surprised. She'd faced worse. But what made this moment different wasn't the disrespect. It was the underestimation. John Carter thought she was decoration. He thought this seat, the one she was forced to occupy along the wall, was as high as she'd ever rise. He thought leadership was something he alone got to define. He had no idea who he had just dismissed. And soon he'd learn exactly what happens when the person you look down on is the one building the floor beneath your feet. Following the carefully masked humiliation in the boardroom, Danielle Brooks returned to her desk with silent resolve and a sharpened sense of awareness. She had expected resistance, but what unfolded next wasn't confrontation. It was erasure. By Wednesday morning, she noticed a peculiar silence in her inbox. Project updates, calendar invites, even general team correspondence had ceased to reach her. She wasn't removed outright, just left out. Danielle conducted a quick internal check on the file-sharing dashboard and confirmed what she suspected. Her access had been quietly revoked from several strategic folders, including the ones she had been directly assigned to manage. The move was subtle but calculated, and she recognized it for exactly what it was: a strategic sidelining orchestrated under the guise of procedural oversight. Rather than raise alarm, she documented everything: timestamps, missing files, lack of permissions, even screenshots of her denied access logs. Meanwhile, the team she was supposed to be leading was reassigned under Evan Clark, a junior analyst with less than half her experience, whose chief qualification appeared to be his golf rapport with John Carter. An internal announcement came through that afternoon stating that effective immediately, campaign analytics oversight would fall under Evan Clark for cross-departmental fluidity. Danielle read it twice, once as a professional and once as a strategist, decoding every corporate euphemism embedded in the phrasing. She made no comment, offered no protest, and waited. That Friday, she noticed her name had also been removed from a client-facing pitch that she'd drafted in its entirety the week prior. When she attempted to log into the company's data visualization tool to pull metrics for a personal assessment, the system denied her access. Instead of alerting IT again, Danielle printed the denial message and filed it in a growing folder labeled Compliance Inconsistencies Internal. On Monday morning of the following week, she walked into a department-wide meeting she had not been invited to, took a seat in the back, and quietly observed. The lead presenter, unsurprisingly, was Evan, who stumbled through a half-polished slide deck full of incomplete charts and irrelevant KPIs. Halfway through his presentation, he drew a flawed conclusion based on outdated numbers from Q1. Danielle waited for someone to correct it. No one did. Then, without raising her voice, she spoke up. Evan, I believe you're missing a significant portion of Gen Z engagement from OTT platforms, specifically TikTok and Snapchat. Those channels accounted for 12% of traffic in Q3. The room fell into a brief silence as heads turned toward the back. Evan fumbled with his clicker, clearly flustered. We were advised those platforms were statistically insignificant, he muttered. Danielle calmly opened her laptop, projected her own report on the screen, and displayed up-to-date data directly sourced from the company's licensed API tools. "This is from our most recent verified dashboard," she said evenly, cross-referenced with third-party benchmarking. "It's live data." The numbers spoke for themselves. John Carter, standing near the screen with his arms folded, narrowed his eyes. "Thank you for the contribution, Danielle," he said with forced neutrality. "Next time, please forward insights in advance, so we can stay on track with the agenda." She nodded once, said nothing further, and resumed her seat. But in that moment, she felt the energy shift. John had underestimated her intellect. He now saw her as a threat, and she saw it in the tightness of his jaw and the way his hand flexed against his hip as if bracing for control. The very next day, Danielle's access to the internal calendar system was revoked. She could no longer see team meetings or strategic planning sessions. She became invisible in a system designed to track everything. Then came the HR report. Without prior discussion, she received a probationary performance review citing limited collaboration and unclear team alignment. The report was signed by John. Beneath his signature was a note recommending role reconsideration before Q2 realignment. Danielle printed that evaluation and pinned it to the back wall of her workstation, directly below her Harvard MBA diploma and above the award she received last year for Global Campaign Strategy Excellence. Anyone passing by could see both documents, one earned by skill, the other assigned by bias. She never mentioned it aloud. She didn't need to. The juxtaposition said everything. Danielle Brooks, now armed with a mental archive of their every slight, navigated the office with the poise of someone walking a tightrope while simultaneously building the net beneath her. The tension in the building wasn't spoken, but it buzzed beneath every surface, in every glance too quickly diverted, in every meeting held 2 doors down without her name on the attendee list. Still, Danielle didn't flinch. She arrived early, left late, and moved with a grace that unnerved the people who expected her to break. On Wednesday morning, she attended a cross-departmental briefing with a major client, a Fortune 100 account that John Carter was personally overseeing. The meeting was held on the 26th floor in one of the company's glass pitch rooms, where both transparency and hierarchy were on full display. Danielle had contributed significantly to the strategy deck being presented, but her name had once again been scrubbed from the author slides. She sat toward the end of the table not by choice, but because when she arrived, the prime seats had already been marked with pre-placed name tags. Hers was nowhere to be found. During the presentation, John made a point to credit Evan for pulling together last-minute insights, a blatant erasure that Danielle met with a cool, measured stare. When the client asked a technical question about influencer segmentation and mobile ad retargeting, Evan fumbled, his explanation vague and poorly constructed. Danielle stepped in with seamless clarity, citing campaign data, referencing current platform metrics, and tying it all back to ROI projections that left the room nodding. The client smiled, visibly impressed. John didn't acknowledge her. Instead, he smoothly redirected, adding, "We've got a sharp team supporting the structure. Our job is to translate it into leadership." That comment, like many others, dripped with intent. Later that day, Danielle was assigned to a client reception dinner at a high-end steakhouse downtown. She was told it was an optional attendance, but when she arrived, she quickly realized everyone else on the list had been strongly encouraged to go. She was the only black woman at the table, seated between the company's VP of Finance and a junior sales associate who seemed confused as to why she was there at all. The evening began politely enough, until the VP leaned over with a half smirk and said, "I'm guessing you're in sales?" Danielle replied, "No strategy." His eyebrows lifted in mock surprise before he took a sip of wine and said, "Interesting." The word hung between them like smoke. Across the table, John raised a glass and said, "Here's to building bridges and breaking barriers," locking eyes with Danielle with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. She clinked her glass, said nothing, and let the toast dissolve into ambient laughter. The next day, her photo was missing from the company's People of Impact newsletter, even though 2 of the men she had trained were featured for their outstanding contribution to client growth. That afternoon, she passed John in the hallway as he walked with a new intern, a white college grad in a powder blue suit, and overheard him say, "Now he looks like someone we could build a division around." He didn't acknowledge her as she walked past. She didn't need him to. She simply paused by the hallway mirror and looked at her own reflection, adjusting the collar of her blazer and repeating her father's words silently. "They'll see you as a threat the moment they realize they can't control you." The crescendo came on Friday, when Danielle received a call from reception requesting her assistance with a visiting executive. Thinking it was related to a scheduled client workshop, she headed to the lobby where a man in an Armani coat and diamond cufflinks was waiting, visibly impatient. "Are you the assistant?" he asked sharply. "I'm Danielle Brooks," she answered, extending a hand. "Director of Strategic Planning." The man blinked, then muttered something under his breath and checked his phone. Behind him, John appeared with a grin and clapped the man on the back. "Ah, looks like you met our new consultant," he said casually. "She's been helping us with diversity metrics." Danielle smiled and turned to the man. "Actually, I lead 3 regional portfolios and oversee revenue growth projections across all channels. But if you prefer a summary based on skin tone, I'm happy to adjust the vocabulary." John's grin faltered, but he quickly masked it with a chuckle. "She's sharp," he said to the executive, who now looked increasingly uncomfortable. Danielle didn't stay for the rest of the tour. She had seen enough. She returned to her office, opened her laptop, and updated her file. New section, Public Incidents. John Carter began testing the limits of how far they could push before she broke. But Danielle didn't break. She adapted. She analyzed. She anticipated their next move with the precision of a strategist who had built her career navigating boardrooms more dangerous than this. The first strike came in the form of an unexpected performance debrief. HR sent her a calendar invite labeled check-in, with no agenda, no warning, and no mention of her manager. When she arrived at the small glass room on the 19th floor, she found both John and Meredith, an HR business partner whose allegiance leaned wherever the power pointed, waiting for her. The conversation began with vague niceties, then pivoted sharply when Meredith produced a printed packet. "We've received some informal concerns," she said, her tone flat. "Feedback about interpersonal fit, communication challenges, and difficulty integrating with the strategic core team." Danielle blinked once. "From who?" she asked. Meredith didn't answer. John stepped in, all fake empathy and practice charm. "We know your background is strong, Danielle," he said, "but culture fit is just as important as execution. And lately, there's been friction." Danielle leaned forward slightly. "If there's documentation of underperformance, I'd like to see the specifics. I haven't missed a deadline, and the campaign I aligned last week helped increase early engagement by 17%. What exactly is being questioned?" Meredith shuffled in her seat while John smirked. "It's more about tone than tasks," he replied. "Team synergy is hard to quantify, but easy to feel when it's off." Danielle nodded slowly, then asked, "Are there similar notes on Evan? On his late data, his incorrect segmentation, or the 5 emails I've corrected on his behalf?" The silence that followed was telling. Meredith scribbled something in her notebook, while John waved a dismissive hand. "Let's not make this adversarial," he said, rising to his feet. "We're just trying to help you find your stride." Danielle stood, too, her expression unreadable. "If my stride seems off, perhaps it's because someone keeps moving the finish line." She walked out without waiting for their response. That afternoon, her internal account was flagged for a random IT audit. She was locked out of the server for 2 hours, right before a client file submission deadline. She made the deadline anyway, rerouting the upload through a backup platform using her personal secure connection. When she sent the final deliverable to the client, she CC'd IT and HR, stating, "Due to unexpected access issues, I've submitted this through an alternative encrypted channel. If protocol has changed, please confirm moving forward." The next morning, she found a printed memo on her chair. It wasn't emailed. It wasn't signed. It was just there, as if it had floated down from the ceiling overnight. It read, "Please remember to channel all external communication through your direct supervisor to maintain message consistency." Beneath it was a yellow post-it with 2 words, per John. That same day, during a client onboarding event, Danielle was asked to stand in as a greeter while the rest of the strategy team conducted the briefing she'd helped design. A junior associate handed her a stack of name tags and smiled nervously. "John said you'd be perfect for this." Danielle held the tags in one hand, her fingers stilling just for a second. Then she smiled back and said, "Of course." She stood at the door, welcoming people whose budgets she had helped forecast, whose industries she knew better than the team behind the glass. Each handshake was an act of quiet defiance. Each greeting a reminder that while they tried to reduce her to a role, she was already operating on a level they couldn't touch. The climax came that Friday. After leaving the office late, Danielle received an email from HR titled "Conduct Review Urgent." In it, she was accused anonymously of being aggressive, undermining team morale, and disrespecting leadership. No evidence, no citations, just phrasing so generic it could have been cut and pasted from a century-old playbook. Danielle sat in her apartment, staring at the screen, then calmly opened her records folder. She attached 6 PDFs, documented patterns, time-stamped communications, data inconsistencies she corrected, and a list of every measurable success she had achieved in less than a month. Then she drafted her reply. "Attached are records supporting my conduct, contribution, and clarity of role. If there are further questions about my professionalism, I welcome a formal inquiry. I also reserve the right to escalate this matter to the Corporate Compliance Office, as these trends are beginning to suggest something beyond miscommunication." Danielle Brooks walked through the front doors of Logan & Myers at 7:45 a.m., sharp, dressed in a graphite gray suit with sharp lapels and a deep emerald blouse that shimmered subtly under the overhead lights. Her eyes were forward, her shoulders squared, and her steps deliberate. But behind her polished exterior, she was tracking every movement, every interaction, every silence that once would have gone unnoticed. The escalation had already begun, and now they were no longer trying to hide it. At 8:10 a.m., an internal email titled "Team Realignment Departmental Efficiency" was sent to all staff. It introduced a new temporary reporting structure that effectively stripped Danielle of her strategic oversight and reassigned her to an operational coordinator named Brad Holt, a mid-level manager best known for botching a vendor negotiation last quarter and sending 4 emails with typos in the subject line. Brad, clearly nervous, approached her desk with a paper packet and a tone that fluctuated between awkward and apologetic. "Hey Danielle," he said, shifting on his feet. "I'm supposed to loop you into a few admin workflows this week. John wants everything funneled through me first, just until we get clarity, you know." Danielle looked at the folder in his hand without reaching for it. "Clarity on what?" she asked, her voice calm. Brad hesitated. "Not sure exactly. Just structure stuff, I guess." She took the folder slowly, flipped through it, then looked up. "These are printer supply logs and office snack inventory orders." Brad nodded. "Yeah." John said it's all part of understanding the full operational scope. She closed the folder and set it aside. "Got it." That afternoon, during the company's bi-weekly all-hands meeting, John stood in front of the team with a wireless mic and a rehearsed ease. He spoke about vision, about leadership, about learning from tension. Then, with a smirk barely masked as a grin, he turned toward the strategy team and added, "Sometimes you've got to trim distractions to let real talent thrive." The room chuckled, some politely, others cautiously. Danielle stood against the far wall, hands folded, watching. That same evening, a junior staffer posted a filtered selfie from the all-hands event on LinkedIn, captioned, "Another day building greatness with our power team. Shout out to our fearless leadership." Danielle was cropped out of the frame, barely a sleeve of her blazer visible in the edge of the shot. 2 days later, John threw a department resilience lunch in honor of the team's recent quarter completion. Everyone received a digital invite, but Danielle's never arrived. A colleague forwarded it to her last minute, whispering, "Thought you might want to know," before slipping away. Danielle showed up anyway. The restaurant was loud, expensive, and bathed in gold tones meant to mimic prestige. John was already there, holding court at the center table, drink in hand, spinning a story about leadership under pressure. When Danielle entered, the volume dipped for a beat, then resumed. She was seated at the end of the secondary table, next to an unpaid intern and across from freelancer who didn't know her name. During his toast, John raised a glass and declared, "To the people who carry the weight. The ones who don't just show up, they step up. And to those who don't get it, maybe the weight was never meant for them." Laughter followed. Danielle sipped her water, nodded once, and excused herself before dessert. But the crescendo came on Friday morning. She walked into the office to find a laminated poster on the wall outside the break room. It read, "Leadership is earned, not assigned," in bold letters above a stock photo of a white man in a navy suit shaking hands with another white man across a conference table. Beneath it was the company's logo and a quote attributed to John Carter. Danielle looked at it for 10 seconds, then calmly peeled it off the wall, folded it twice, and placed it into her tote bag. Back at her desk, she found a new memo, this time printed in color, sitting on her keyboard. It stated that due to workflow friction, her participation in cross-functional meetings was paused until further notice. The final line read, "In the meantime, please support logistics coordination as requested by your interim manager." Danielle read it once, then again, then tucked it next to the poster in her bag. The final blow came not in paper form, but via social media. That night, a photo went live from an off-site executive mixer. The leadership team, glasses raised, captioned, "Only the strong remain." Danielle Brooks had become a ghost in the very office where her qualifications once promised influence. Her name was no longer mentioned in briefings. Her ideas, once presented with strategic intent, were now filtered through other mouths or buried entirely. Her desk, once central to collaboration, now felt like an island, distant, dismissed, and deliberately isolated. But if they believed silence meant surrender, they had miscalculated everything. Danielle wasn't retreating. She was recording. Every action taken against her had been cataloged, filed, printed, and secured off-site. Every email exclusion, every unauthorized access denial, every redirect through Brad's inept oversight had been stored chronologically in an encrypted archive under the title, Hostile Work Record Confidential. She had even documented the hallway poster and the so-called leadership quotes, cross-referencing them against company policy and DI commitments outlined in quarterly investor reports. And while John Carter walked the halls like a king, growing more arrogant with each passing day, Danielle listened. She listened when Brad whispered to a colleague that Danielle was probably on her way out. She listened when two team leads chuckled at the idea of her ever leading a division. And she listened most carefully when John, standing in the break room with his back to her, said to the finance director, "This is what happens when you hire from a quota instead of from quality." That moment wasn't just another entry in her documentation. It was the turning point. Because standing nearby, quietly stacking cups at the side table, was Maria, the overnight janitor. Maria, who always smiled when she passed Danielle. Maria, who'd once worked as a legal assistant before her immigration papers were delayed. That night, as Danielle prepared to leave, Maria approached her in the underground garage, holding a folded piece of paper. Her voice was low, nervous. "I heard what he said. I've heard worse. I just wanted you to know someone sees it." The paper was a note, handwritten, with a time and direct quote from John's conversation. "I don't want anything," Maria said. "But if you ever speak out, I'll back it up." Danielle took the paper, nodded once, and said softly, "Thank you. That matters more than you know." The next morning, an anonymous envelope appeared on Danielle's desk. No name, no note. Inside were printed copies of internal Slack messages, screenshots that showed John directing Evan to make her spin her wheels, and another where Brad joked about assigning Danielle birthday cake inventory as her next project. Danielle read them without blinking, then placed them into her evidence folder. That afternoon, she received a calendar invite from IT for a security audit review. Suspicious but composed, she attended. There, a junior IT tech named Leo pulled her aside discreetly and said, "Off the record, I checked the logs. Someone's been accessing your profile remotely. Not normal behavior." It wasn't from your IP. Danielle thanked him and later that night submitted a formal request to HR for an internal data privacy investigation, CCing compliance, and the VP of risk management. Her email was professional, concise, and legally framed. She included attachments, timestamps, and a brief statement of concern that read, "Should this pattern continue, I may be forced to involve external counsel to ensure data protection and professional integrity." Within 12 hours, she received a meeting request from HR, not the usual associate, but the Director of Employee Integrity. The subject line was simple: escalation review. Meanwhile, John Carter remained unaware. That same day, he hosted a virtual webinar on modern leadership in diverse environments, smiling through every slide about equity, inclusion, and the value of open dialogue. Danielle watched it from her desk with the sound off, her eyes never leaving the playback bar. She took a screenshot of the webinar title next to his name, filed it under Contradiction Exhibit, and moved on. But the real storm came later that week. While scanning her spam folder for a misplaced client email, Danielle discovered an internal thread that had been accidentally forwarded by a third-party partner. In it, John referred to her as the wild card, stating that he'd contain the narrative if she ever tried to escalate. He even joked that no one believes the angry ones. That single sentence was a gift wrapped in arrogance. Danielle printed the email, locked it in her briefcase, and emailed herself a copy to a secured cloud vault. That Friday, she stepped into the elevator and found herself alone with Natalie, the only colleague who'd ever looked her in the eye without condescension. Natalie hesitated, then said, "They're planning something. A reassignment. But this time it's formal." Danielle didn't ask how she knew. She just replied, "Let them write it." And when Natalie looked puzzled, Danielle added, "I've already written the ending." That Monday morning began like any other, with the same routine of exclusion and veiled condescension. John Carter strolled through the open floor wearing his signature smirk and a new navy jacket, passing her without a glance, while Brad asked her to double-check snack vendor invoices for the third time that week. But Danielle simply nodded, printed the request, and added it to her folder. At 11:17 a.m., a company-wide email dropped with the subject, "Executive Leadership Restructure Announcement." The entire office buzzed within seconds. Monitors lit up with curiosity. Threads popped. Slack exploded. At the bottom of the email, there was a name that no one had ever seen in connection with this branch before: Danielle Brooks, Executive Vice President, Global Strategy and Organizational Risk. At first, people thought it was a mistake. Then someone pointed out the memo was signed by the CEO himself. And then the elevator chimed. When the doors opened, Danielle stepped out, not in her usual sharp office attire, but in a formal tailored suit, the kind designed not to impress, but to assert. Beside her stood two people, a senior attorney from corporate and the chief people officer. The hush that fell over the floor was immediate and total. Danielle didn't look left or right. She walked straight down the hallway, her stride steady, her eyes fixed. John Carter stood frozen outside his office, half in conversation with a regional director, unaware that the storm he had brewed was now walking toward him in heels. "Ms. Brooks," said the chief people officer loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "would you like to address the team before we begin?" Danielle stopped just a few feet from John, turned, and scanned the room. Her voice, clear and calm, carried across the floor with the kind of effortless command no one could teach. "Some of you may know me as a consultant, others as a coordinator, but effective immediately. I am the new EVP overseeing all North American operations, including this region, and we have a lot to talk about." John didn't move. His face twitched, trying to arrange itself into a neutral expression, but failing. "There must be a misunderstanding," he said, addressing the chief people officer. "Danielle M.S. Brooks isn't on the regional board." Danielle turned to him, her smile surgical. "You're right. I'm not on the regional board. I sit above it." Then she held up her tablet, swiped once, and mirrored her screen to the floor's overhead monitors. The display shifted to show a clean, labeled timeline, dates, actions, quotes, anonymized witnesses, and a series of HR reports that had mysteriously gone unprocessed. Over the past 7 weeks, she began, I've documented a pattern of workplace harassment, discrimination, data manipulation, and strategic sabotage that directly violates this company's code of conduct and federal employment law. Several jaws dropped. John opened his mouth, but she raised her hand. You've had your turn. You used it to humiliate, exclude, and attempt to destroy a woman you assumed was beneath you. Now it's my turn. She gestured toward the lawyer, who stepped forward and handed John a sealed envelope. You are hereby placed on immediate administrative leave pending a formal investigation, the lawyer said. You are not to access company systems, communicate with staff, or enter this building without written authorization. Gasps broke through the stunned silence. Danielle turned back to the team. For those of you who enabled this behavior, your complicity has been noted. For those of you who stayed silent, I understand. But today, silence ends. A new code begins. As security escorted John from the floor, Danielle walked into his office, not as a guest, not as a visitor, but as the woman who now owned the desk. She closed the door behind her, opened her laptop, and started a new file. It was titled Reconstruction. Outside, the office slowly stirred back to life, but nothing would ever return to how it was. The hierarchy had been reset. The game had changed, and the person they had tried to erase had just rewritten the entire rulebook. The dust had barely settled from John Carter's public removal when Danielle Brooks began executing her authority, not with vengeance, but with calculated, surgical precision. The following hours were a masterclass in leadership transition. She didn't raise her voice, didn't gloat, and didn't waste a second explaining herself to those who had already shown who they were. Instead, she issued her first directive via internal memo, effective immediately. A third-party audit of personnel files, communication logs, and HR complaint archives will begin across the Western region. That single line sent a chill through the entire floor. Managers scrambled to double-check files they thought no one would ever question. Slack channels went silent. Side conversations disappeared. Danielle followed it up with a brief meeting, attendance mandatory. She stood at the front of the conference room, where only weeks earlier she had been forced to sit along the wall. This isn't about retaliation, she said plainly. This is about restoration. Her tone was calm, but every syllable landed with authority. Restoration of accountability, restoration of integrity, and for some of you, restoration of reality. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. The ones who needed to hear it were already sweating. During that same meeting, she projected a list of new initiatives previously proposed but ignored, now formalized under her leadership. Among them, an anonymous reporting platform managed by a third-party legal group, mandatory bias and ethics retraining for all mid to senior level managers, and a new leadership mentorship track reserved for overlooked high potential talent across all demographics. Danielle didn't just announce change, she activated it. And then came the moment no one saw coming. She tapped her tablet and played an audio recording. It was John Carter's voice, unmistakable, saying the words that had once humiliated her near the break room. This is what happens when you hire from a quota instead of from quality. The room froze. No one breathed. This recording was submitted to compliance by a third-party witness and validated for authenticity, Danielle said. Let it be known that we don't bury the truth. We confront it. A junior analyst in the corner wiped tears from her cheek. An HR rep quietly closed her laptop, as if finally recognizing that her silence had also been heard. But Danielle wasn't done. She looked up, straight at the chief operating officer who had flown in from headquarters to witness the transition, and said, "It's not enough to replace one leader. We need to dismantle the structure that enabled him." That means auditing HR itself. There were no cheers, no clapping, just stunned silence, the kind that comes when people realize they are no longer protected by politics and no longer immune to consequence. Later that day, Danielle returned to her new office, John's former corner suite. She opened his drawer, found a half-drunk bottle of bourbon and a stack of old business cards labeled Regional Kingmaker, and threw them into a sealed box marked Archive. She didn't need souvenirs of his arrogance. She had something better: results. Within 48 hours, 2 senior HR personnel were placed on leave for mishandling complaints. A regional finance manager who had signed off on a false expense report tied to Danielle's reassignment was called into legal review. And Evan Clark, the intern-turned-proxy strategist, submitted his resignation before Monday morning. Danielle didn't block it. She let him go without ceremony, without spite. Just one line in her reply, "All the best." Because power didn't require spectacle. It required stability. She spent the rest of the week meeting with department heads, but not in offices or corner lounges. She met them in their own spaces, stood where they stood, asked questions they weren't used to answering, and took notes not just on operations, but on culture. She wanted to know who led with fear, who led with silence, and who had the courage to lead it all. By Friday, her name was on every wall, not because she demanded it, but because people were starting to understand something radical had happened. No one was exempt from scrutiny now, not the senior executives who once looked the other way, not the HR managers who quietly filed complaints into digital black holes, and certainly not John Carter, who now sat at home on mandatory leave, waiting for the verdict he never imagined would come. While the Western Region's staff adjusted to the new order, Danielle was already moving 2 steps ahead. On Monday morning, she initiated a surprise audit, instructing the external legal team to begin interviews with former employees who had left under unusual circumstances. She tracked resignation trends, flagged anomalies in exit reviews, and found a disturbing pattern. Every 3 to 6 months, a person of color or a female employee in a leadership track role had mysteriously been moved, minimized, or monitored out of the system. Danielle didn't speculate. She documented. And when the legal team confirmed that at least 4 prior employees had valid claims of suppression and targeted marginalization, she signed off on the formal launch of a multi-division compliance probe, flagged as Priority 1. News of the investigation spread like wildfire, even as Danielle remained composed, issuing no public statements, only instructions. But inside her office, she made one phone call to the CEO himself. Their conversation was short. She didn't ask for approval. She informed him of the action being taken. "We'll be transparent," she said, "but we will not be lenient." The CEO hesitated, then agreed. "Clean house," he told her. And so she did. By Wednesday, John Carter was officially terminated, not quietly, not through some vague PR statement, but via internal memo citing violation of ethical standards, workplace harassment, and abuse of authority. His badge was deactivated, his access revoked, his pension package frozen pending litigation. HR delivered the memo to his home address with a formal notice from corporate legal attached. Danielle didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply removed his name from the regional reporting structure and moved on. Within the hour, his nameplate was taken down, replaced with a blank placard that read "Reassignment pending leadership under review." But the fallout didn't stop there. Meredith from HR, who had facilitated the false evaluations against Danielle and mishandled at least 2 discrimination claims, was escorted from the building by security after refusing to cooperate with investigators. She tried to protest. She cried. She called the removal unwarranted and humiliating. Danielle watched her walk out from her office window, stone-faced. Because humiliation, Danielle knew, wasn't punishment. It was only a taste of what they had made others swallow for years. Brad Holt, the paper pusher turned puppet manager, received a letter of demotion and reassignment to a remote compliance training unit, without title, team, or influence. When he entered Danielle's office seeking one last conversation, she granted him 5 minutes. He fumbled through apologies, talked about being caught in the middle, and claimed, "I never meant harm." Danielle listened, then calmly replied, "Intentions don't erase consequences. You didn't have to speak up, but you chose to assist. And now, you will live with that choice." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Power doesn't shout. It stands still and lets the truth do the work. By Friday, the Western Region office no longer resembled the toxic fortress it once was. Posters about earning leadership were removed. A bulletin board once filled with quotes from John was replaced with profiles of new mentorship candidates, diverse, overlooked, and finally seen. Danielle herself didn't appear in a single photo. She refused any media requests, turning down interviews with 2 major publications. "This isn't about me," she told her assistant. "It's about resetting a broken system, not branding one survivor." And yet, her presence reverberated through every corner of the company. Former employees began reaching out. Resumes from across the country arrived with subject lines that read, "Heard about the change." And finally, "A place where leadership means something again." Danielle read each one. She didn't just build a legacy. In the weeks following the corporate purge, Logan and Myers underwent a transformation that extended far beyond headlines and disciplinary actions. Under Danielle Brooks' leadership, justice was no longer a concept written into training manuals. It was embedded into the very foundation of the company's rebirth. But Danielle didn't stop at punishing the corrupt or removing the incompetent. She believed true justice wasn't about removal. It was about rebuilding with intention. And so she began phase 2, not a vengeance, but a vision. She launched a new internal initiative named Justice First, a sweeping reform plan that rewrote the company's culture from the inside out. At its core was a confidential digital reporting system run by an independent ethics board, not HR. Every employee, from intern to executive, was required to complete a recertification in bias awareness, ethical leadership, and structural equity. Promotions were frozen until audits were completed. Danielle didn't care about pushback. She welcomed it. "If you're uncomfortable," she said in a town hall, "you're probably part of the problem." She didn't sugarcoat the process. She didn't soften the edges. But she always spoke with clarity and purpose, and her consistency made her impossible to ignore. Within 1 quarter, employee retention rose by 20%. Applications from underrepresented candidates increased by nearly 40. Anonymous surveys reported the highest trust ratings the regional office had ever recorded. People weren't just surviving now, they were thriving. But for Danielle, the change wasn't about numbers. It was about faces. One afternoon, she walked through the office and noticed Maria, the janitor who had once slipped her a note of truth, cleaning the windows in the executive suite. Danielle approached her, smiled, and said, "Would you be willing to come upstairs for a meeting next week?" Maria looked startled, unsure how to respond. Danielle added, "I'm creating a new workplace advisory panel, and I need people who understand what it means to see everything, but be seen by no one." Maria nodded slowly, eyes wide with emotion. "I'd be honored." That meeting would later become the prototype for a rotating internal council made up of every layer of the organization, voicing truths that had gone unheard for far too long. Danielle didn't just give seats at the table. She rebuilt the table, and word spread. Articles surfaced, not by her hand, but by those who witnessed the shift. One op-ed read, "She didn't burn bridges, she replaced them with stone." Her name began appearing on leadership panels, case studies, and academic forums about organizational transformation. But Danielle declined every keynote, every spotlight. Her focus remained on the people in the building, not the cameras outside of it. One morning, as she passed through the lobby, she noticed a new intern standing frozen in front of the glass wall where the leadership portraits hung. The girl, young, black, bright-eyed, was staring at the row of frames with a mix of awe and uncertainty. Danielle stepped beside her and asked, "You see something you like?" The intern looked at her and whispered, "I just never thought I'd see someone like me up there." Danielle smiled softly and replied, "Then let's make sure you're next." That moment wasn't documented. It didn't go viral. But it was the kind of legacy Danielle cared about. Quiet, real, transformational. And while the rest of the corporate world debated trends, she built permanence. In her final act before the end of the fiscal year, Danielle introduced one last policy, the whistle clause, a rule that required leadership to not only protect whistleblowers, but to incentivize transparency. Those who spoke up with integrity would be eligible for advancement, not punishment. When asked why, Danielle answered simply, "Truth should never cost you your future." As winter settled over the skyline, the office felt different. It moved slower, with purpose. It listened more, laughed more, lived more. people stopped walking on eggshells and started walking taller. And while John Carter's name faded into quiet embarrassment, Danielle Brooks became more than a name. She became a shift, a standard, a story told in conference rooms across the country, not because she fought back, but because she redefined what winning looks like. Not in silence, not in anger, but in legacy. The end. If this story moved you or made you think differently about power, justice, or how we treat others, don't forget to like and subscribe for more narratives that reveal what happens when truth rises above prejudice. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Which moment hit you the hardest? What would you have done in her shoes? And let us know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. Let's talk.